Ask Dan Schneider. S.K. Williams writes in and says to me, Dan, you talk a lot about phoniness in the arts, but I rarely hear you talk about phoniness in poetry, either in these audios or videos or in writing. What do you think is the biggest phony in all of poetry? Well, I think you probably mean by that is who I think are the worst poets or whatnot, and I've written lots about that. So let me take a little bit of a different tack to your query. I would say that the phoniness in art and the phoniness in poetry in general is probably best exemplified by grandiose claims that people make, and I can give you probably three good examples of it. The first would be the claim, and it's a false one, that poetry slam started with a guy named Mark Smith back in the early to mid 1980s in Chicago. Smith was a bad spoken word artist, and he claimed that he started poetry slams at a restaurant called the Green Mill in Chicago in the 1980s. And while I'm not denying that he started that and actually came up maybe perhaps with the term poetry slam, poetry slams were going on for a good 10 to 15 years beforehand. They simply weren't called poetry slams. When I was a young boy, in my neighborhood, for example, which bordered on a black and Hispanic neighborhood, we would often go to see things like cockfights or dogfights, and often in that milieu, there would be what were called dozens tosses. Anyone who has ever ranked someone out or gotten into a dissing contest knows that to do the dozens means to basically do, oh, your mama this, whatever. Well, in a similar vein, out of that evolved the reading of written works, poems, diary entries by people, and they would get up and they would emote. It was exactly the same thing as what we call poetry slams today, except they didn't call them poetry slams. So the idea that Mark Smith invented poetry slams is simply false. He may have come up with the term, but even these dozen tosses were scored by the audience as to who beat whom in the rank out session or the dozens toss. Where the term dozens toss, why that was called, I'm not quite sure. So that's one good example of a guy who really didn't contribute anything trying to stake his claim onto something historically. Another good example is James Emanuel, a poet that I have long championed the work of, but I have to sort of debunk a claim that he made and that a lot of the people who have listened to James's poetry make, and that is that James came up with the idea of jazz haiku. Now, just like Mark Smith, James may have been the first to come up with the term jazz haiku, but I don't think so. James started doing this in the mid to late 80s. Like poetry slams, poets were doing haikus for decades beforehand, and they were doing it set to jazz music and in doing American jazzy versions of this. So jazz haikus certainly predated James Emanuel's claim on it by at least 2 or 3 decades. And like Mark Smith, he may have just only coined the term, but unlike Smith, I have a feeling that I recall, I can't say specifically, hearing the term beforehand. So that would be a second example, poetry slams and jazz haiku. I don't think James Emanuel was knowingly bullshitting the way Mark Smith was, because James Emanuel lived outside of the U.S. for many years, and he was an academic before he left, so he probably just did not know. And the final example of phoniness in poetry that I would address is twofold, and it has to do with William Shakespeare. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I think that William Shakespeare was a great writer and poet, but he's also probably the most overrated artist in history. Out of 37 plays, he has maybe 7 or 8 great plays. Out of 154 sonnets, he has maybe 7 or 8 great sonnets, and he has maybe 24 to maybe 30 great soliloquies in his plays, which are better than anything he wrote in his sonnets. So that's his claim to fame. He wrote a lot of garbage too. But two claims that Shakespeare make, or that Shakespeareans make about Shakespeare, which are demonstrably untrue, is that A, he came up with a Shakespearean sonnet form, which is different from the Petrarchan sonnet of 6 and 8, or 8 and 6 line stanzas, by doing the 4-4-4-2. A quick look at poetry notebooks, and I know I've seen books of poetry that had sonnets written 100 to 150 years before Shakespeare, shows that other people had done them. They simply hadn't done them as obsessively as Shakespeare. So Shakespeare did not invent the Shakespearean sonnet form. He just made it popular for people after him to come and do. And the second thing about Shakespeare that's a load of bullshit is the claim that, depending on who you listen to, that he coined anywhere from about 1,000 to 3,000 new English words. This is simply not true, and I remember reading a magazine article back, I think in the 80s or 90s, that debunked a lot of the claims about a lot of the common words that are associated with Shakespeare being created by him. Just like poetry slams or jazz haiku, this simply isn't so. Shakespeare was taking language from the gutter, so certainly, let's say even if he had only neologized 500 words for the first time in print, probably maybe only a few of them, maybe a few dozen were actually coined by him. The rest he had heard. There's lots of words in my own work that I know people reading would say, oh, that's a neologism that Dan came up with, when really just 3 or 4 decades removed, I'm just using words that I grew up with as a child that people now in the pop culture have forgotten. The same is true with Shakespeare, and as I said, there have been others who have written about Shakespeare and his neologisms not being what they were. So those are 3 of them: Mark Smith, James Emanuel, and William Shakespeare. It shows you go from great to the absurdity of Mark Smith. But poetry has bullshit at all levels. Thanks for the question.